Welcome to the Film Florida podcast. My name is John Lux, and I'm the Executive Director of Film Florida. Thanks for downloading this episode of the podcast. Before we talk to our guest, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the Film Florida podcast. If you're not already a member, please consider joining Film Florida at filmflorida.org. Finally, we still have a Film Florida merchandise page. Go to teespring.com/stores/Film Florida to purchase Film Florida t-shirts, sweatshirts, coffee mugs, and now protective masks as well. Patrick Inhofer is an accomplished film and video colorist with a pedigree in editing and finishing. He has more than 30 years of professional experience in delivering high-quality programming for broadcast, commercial, corporate, and indie clients. For 10 plus years, he's also developed a career in teaching others how to digitally color correct and has been active in developing community resources for professional and aspiring colorists. Here's my conversation with Patrick Inhofer. Thanks for joining us on the Film Florida podcast today, Patrick.
John, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm honored to be here and happy to be in this Florida community.
So what's your backstory? Where did you come from?
Yeah, so I am not born and bred in Florida. I came from the Northeast, New York specifically. I graduated from Hofstra University with a Bachelor of Science in Film Television Production. And when I graduated, I had a choice. I could go like the DP route because I love cameras and lights and I love technology. And, you know, even back when I graduated college in 1988, so I've been doing this for a little while. Even back then, you know, it was a very technical craft. It was lots of light meters if you were shooting film, and it was understanding exposures. And I loved that aspect of filmmaking and storytelling, of course. But I also loved the craft of editing and post-production. And, you know, at Hofstra University, we had access to undergrads. We had access to full production studios. We had access to an online editing suite, which was an ABC roll, tape-based, timecode-based system. So I learned how to use timecode, edit to timecode. Back in the day when that was actually, you know, that was a thing. You know, it was not easy. It was all, you know, it was complicated. And so I loved that as well. And I quickly figured out with my first gig that I ever got working for a very small company called Northeast Video, and where I was able to do everything. I was able to go out and shoot, and I was able to edit. I learned very quickly that I hated going out in the field and shooting when I only had an hour to set up. I'd have our subject that we'd interview, and then we had an hour to break down, we'd have to get out. So it was a lot of corporate stuff. And I just hated doing that. I love the notion of filmmaking where, like, we're going to set the lights, we're going to block things out, we're going to rehearse. Like that I liked. And in New York City, there just wasn't a lot of that. There weren't a lot of opportunities to do that kind of work. But I really did love the post-production side of it. Online suites back in the day looked like, you know, the bridge of the Starship Enterprise. And that was my desire. I wanted to go into online editing. And that's what I did. And I ended up working at several big post houses in New York City's in the late 80s and throughout the 90s. And I kind of became a specialist in editing, but then also editing for air. So I had to tell a story, but when I was done telling the story, it was going to be broadcast, you know, sometimes later that night. So I also had to know how to make things look good. I had to know how to make things sound good because there wasn't anyone following up behind me. And by the end of the 90s, I'd become an online finisher. That was my specialty. And I leveraged that as we moved into the nonlinear world. I leveraged that by going into, you know, working on the Avid Symphony, the Smoke, eventually then Final Cut. And then that brings me through the 2000s, you know, the first decade of this century, where I specialized and made the transition out of editing into color grading. I found that I really enjoyed crafting the final image. I really enjoyed the fact that I knew what good images looked like. I knew how to deliver that. And I found that gave me a value add that differentiated me from my peers at the time. And so I could get a job as an editor and then parlay another 3 or 4 days as a colorist to finish it. I got to the point where I wouldn't work for you as an editor unless you also hired me to do the color. And if you didn't hire me to do color, I wasn't taking your job because I didn't want my stuff going out on air if it wasn't color corrected, right? It became it became a signature thing for me, right? And I remember I actually had a client after we finished the edit. They're like, yeah, they've decided not to color correct. And I said, all right, take my name off the credits. I said, excuse me? I said, take my name off the credits. I said, I don't want to be credited with this if it goes out looking like this. I can't have that. That's my reputation. Blood drained from everyone's face in the room. And they're like, you really want us to go to the producer back with that? I said, I don't care. Like, this was the agreement we had. And this is how I run my business and my craft. And they sent me home. And like 2 days later, they called back and said, guess what, Patrick? You're going to finish the show. You're going to color correct it. We'll put your name on it. And everything was hunky-dory. And eventually I just got to the point where I stopped editing and I was a full-time colorist. And around the mid-2000s, I started teaching. So I'd been asked by Michael Vitti, who passed away a couple of years later, who was the president of the New York Final Cut Pro user group in Manhattan. And I started teaching color correction, how to use the 3-way color wheels and all of that. And at the time, it was very basic and very fundamental and completely foreign to everyone. No one understood this craft. Color correction was a plugin. It wasn't a craft to a lot of video people. And it wasn't until Apple bought this piece of software called Final Touch, which all it did was color correction, right? It was like the DaVinci Resolve of the time. It was a competitor of DaVinci Resolve in the 2000s. So Apple buys this software and then releases it as Apple Color for free as part of Final Cut Studio. And that's the moment where it suddenly dawned on clients that color correction wasn't a plugin that you just did as an afterthought. It was an actual skill set with craftspeople who spent time mastering this craft, and it was worth paying someone a premium to spend 4 or 5 days on your feature film to do the color. And, I used to say back at the time that Apple was my biggest marketing tool, because they were pushing Apple Color like crazy, and there just weren't a lot of people who could talk about it or could do it or could understand it. And then there was a lot of integration with Final Cut and how did that work, and it was a big mess, and so there was a skill set involved there. And so it was during that period of time where I transitioned full-time into color grading. And so that's what I did for another 10 years until I moved down here to Florida in 2014. I still do that today. I have a little bit more of a low-key presence than maybe I had in earlier times as far as professional color grading. Most of my work tends to be referrals. So most of my clients are coming to me from my other clients, or they're coming back to me for more work. I don't do a lot of advertising. I don't, even my website kind of fell a little fallow until about a year ago. I looked at it and said, this website is so freaking old. Almost everything on here makes no sense, and I just shut it down. When you called to set up this interview, John, I told my wife, I probably really need to rebuild my website and just have something there for clients to find me, new clients to find me, especially clients in Florida who may not be all that aware of me, except maybe through one of my other companies, my training companies, where they might find me there and they hear me talk about being in Orlando. And so that's kind of the broad story as to where I started and where I ended up. And color grading to me is actually a combination of my two passions, where when I started out, when I got into this business, which was, crafting the visual in front of the screen and the technicality of our business behind the screen. And for me, color grading is the perfect merging of those two passions. And I get to work with amazing DPs and cinematographers. As a colorist, you're working with the A-level talent on any project. So you're working with the director, the producer, the executive producer. So you're having these intimate conversations, although you are coming in at the end of the projects. Sometimes I feel like, I'm like the little outsider, and everyone's been working on this thing for like 18 months. And, the crew is all together for 30 shoot days. And I'm the guy who kind of comes tiptoeing in the back, and like I work on it and put my fingerprints on it for 5 days, and then away it goes. But what I find is the relationship I build with that talent in that one-on-one space is extremely satisfying and very impactful. and they take it super seriously because when you're done, you're done. When I'm done, we're basically done. Maybe they've got some mix work left to do, maybe some visual effects work left to do, but really we're done. And for them, it's the end of this really long process. Many of them are very invested in these projects because I do a lot of work for indie filmmakers. And yeah.
Well, in my former life, when I was working more, in the day-to-day part of the industry, the hardest thing we had to do as a company in dealing with clients was to convince them that color correction and audio mixing was important on anything. It didn't matter
Yes.
whether it was a corporate piece or whether it was an indie film or a commercial or whatever. But a lot of clients unfortunately saw that as the two quickest spots they could save some money and say, oh, the
Yep.
picture's okay. We recorded good audio. We don't need to go to mixing. I mean, that was kind of the thing. And we gave the editor the mix or the music to drop in, like that was kind of the thing. And it was like, oh boy, we're gonna have to have that conversation again. So yeah, I understand what you're saying. And then you had mentioned, about a decade ago, you co-founded Mixlight.
Mixing Light.
What is that?
So Mixing Light, well, there's actually a pre-story to that, which is when I started training back in 2006, mostly going to user groups. And there was a point at which it became clear that I wanted to do something online. I enjoyed going to conferences, but I'm kind of what you might call an extroverted introvert, which means that when I'm in with large groups of people, I tire. It doesn't energize me, it drains me. I was like, if I want to do more of this, I should probably switch to online where I can be a little bit more my introverted self and expend my energy that way and teach people how to do this. I started a website called taoofcolor.com, TAO of color.com. And that website today is largely the landing page for my weekly color correction newsletter. So I have a newsletter that goes out every week and wraps up the major stories of anyone who's related in the craft of color grading. It wraps up and shares major news stories from around the web. It could be software, it could be hardware, it could be crafts, the craftsmanship of the trade. But for a long time, it was also a training site. So I specialized in what I called grade-alongs, where I would film myself color grading a short film, shot by shot, step by step, through my entire process. Then you, as the purchaser of my training, would download the short film, follow along with me, and here's the key to this particular training. You would give me your project file. So if we did this in Apple Color at the time, or then DaVinci Resolve later on, you'd send me your project file. We both using the same footage. And at specific points, I would say, okay, now send me your project file, and I'd record critiques of your work, useful critiques to help you get better at what it is you're doing, show you what you should do and what you need to look at to improve, make those revisions, and then we'd move on through the process, at which point when you do then apply the final look, and then I do a final critique on your final grade. So I did that for a couple of years, hugely popular, really, really popular. And around this time, two other colorists came to me, Robbie Carmen and Dan Moran. And they said, hey, Patrick, we've noticed what you're doing online. We've talked to a bunch of other people, but we're thinking of doing like a membership website. And so we talked for about a couple weeks about this. And then finally in 2013, we're like, let's do it. The three of us, we're going to form a company. We're calling it Mixing Light. And we are going to release on a regular basis every month a batch of tutorials on mixinglight.com for colorists by colorists, right? Or for people who want to learn the craft of color correction, right? And all of us had been trainers before. Dan Moran, he'd been a trainer for DaVinci Systems, which later got bought by Blackmagic. And Robbie Carmen, I mean, he's written 7 books on Premiere and Final Cut. He's a Adobe Max. He's like their top 3 instructors for the annual Adobe Max. And so, all three of us had this training background. And I think what makes us good at what we do in this environment is we're very self-aware of why we do what we do. And so very often I'll talk to a colorist. I'll say, well, why do you use that tool? And they'll say, well, because it gives me the results I want. And they don't really spend a lot of time thinking about why are they reaching for that button that they're reaching for, and when is it that they decide not to reach for that button, right? And try something else. And one of the things we're good at, and we've since added a bunch of contributors, we probably have about 15 or 20 contributors at this point over the last 6 or 7 years. And I think one of the things that our contributors are also good at, and we find these people who are also good at doing this type of thing, who are very observant and want to understand why are they making the choices they're making, and then are good at communicating the why to someone else so that they can decide, oh, maybe I could try that. I can actually try executing that because I've got the basis, the framework of their decision making. And maybe it's right for me, maybe it's wrong for me, but at least I can try their approach and decide if I want to integrate it or not. And it's a very small niche, a very small community. And so, all of us steal from each other. It's like you go to a trade show when we had trade shows, and you watch someone else give a presentation, and you come up and say, man, I loved what you talked about there. And then you go ahead and you record training. You're like, I just saw this amazing thing by this amazing colorist at this trade show. He gave me this great idea, and then I riffed on it a little bit, and here's my take on his approach. And then you get people writing in the comments for our individual insights. We call each of these tutorials an insight. So on each of these individual insights, we get people writing back, telling us, our members, writing, hey, that was a great idea. And then I tried this and I got this result. And so it's a communication back and forth. It's a sharing of ideas under the assumption that there really is very little that's proprietary in what it is we do. Color grading is one of those things where it's very simple to understand, but rather complicated to execute. And so the rules are simple. Execution can be a bit of a hassle. And that's kind of where we kind of bridge between the simplicity of the concept and the complexity of execution.
Well, and that leads into what I was going to ask you about. Do you ever worry that you're giving away too much of your intellectual property? I mean, you've invested a lot of time and energy and money in becoming an expert in your field, but here you are, instructing people on how to do what you do. And you mentioned the execution, but are you making it too easy for people to be colorists?
They're going to do it anyway. It has to be done. The tools are there. I mean, it's you can download DaVinci Resolve for free, right? And the notion that I'm going to lose out a job to someone who downloaded for the first time the software a month ago, spent a month watching all of my training, and is going to take a job from me. If I add so little value to what my clients bring to me that can happen, I think that's more a reflection on me than anything else, right? And so it's up to me to keep moving in my craft so that by the time you catch up to me, I'm already 10 steps down the road working with these other concepts. And one of the good things that helps, that doesn't worry me about that type of problem, and frankly, we've had a ton of pushback in the early days. When we launched Mixing Light, before that Tower Color, I'd have lunch at conferences with highly accomplished people yelling at me for exactly this reason. Since then, they've become our biggest supporters because you know who we're training? We're training their overnight shift. We're training the people who back them up, right? And so they'll send them to us to get their juniors trained up so that when they need them to step up, they're ready to go. And so what we've found is that most of the professionals have finally come around to understanding, the cows are out of the barn and there is no fencing to keep them in and you can't herd them. And so you might as well embrace the notion that you may have a particular idea or technique, or maybe you bring together multiple ideas and techniques to create your approach, but none of those techniques or ideas individually are exclusively yours, And even back in the day, even back in the 90s, I joined a big post house and I was taught the secret sauce of the lead visual effects artist because my job was to take his seat as he moved on to another position. And so I needed to learn this secret thing that he did. And it was highly proprietary. And I was like one of two people in the company that were allowed to learn it. And it turned out I had been doing exactly that for 5 years. what he had turned into this marketing thing I'd been doing for years to achieve the same result. The difference between him and me is his marketing of that technique, not the technique itself. So I learned very early that there are no secrets. And if you think something's secret, you're deluding yourself. But you can market things that other people do and make it yours so that when they sell themselves, they're going to have to find something different to market from because you've already owned that particular thing, right? So, I don't take a lot of credence in the notion that I am somehow, taking dinner off of my plate, food off of my plate, and giving it to someone else. I think it's responsible, especially after I've been in this business 30 years. I started this business 15 years after I'd already gotten into, almost 20 years after I'd gotten into the business. The notion that somehow I'm never going to give back, that in this day and age where I had so many really talented editors and finishers teach me so much because I was on space with them physically and knowing how no fault of our business, no, it's not anyone's fault. We've decentralized. And there are many great things about decentralization. The one really crummy thing is how do you learn? How do you learn from skilled professionals? And I think what we offer through Mixing Light is part of that solution. And it's part of my responsibility, I believe. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. It's to bring on the next generation, to do for others what was done for me. And except in my situation back in the 90s, it was a team of 7 or 8 people training a team of 7 or 8 people. Well, now what I've got is at Mixing Light, a team of 15 people, but they're teaching a team of 1,500 people. And the accessibility of the tools means so much more content is being created that I'm not taking any food off of my table because whereas there might have been, 5 television shows that you might have been competing against and maybe bidding on, now there are 500. There's so many more channels, so many more distribution options, so many more people who are willing to pay someone to come in and optimize their images that the opportunity for me to find work is as prevalent today as it was 15 years ago.
Interesting. I love your take on it. This is a wildly vague question, and that's kind of on purpose because I want you to take it anywhere you want to go. What's the biggest change in the industry from your perspective over the last decade? And I mean, I'm not talking about this is more than a decade, but linear to nonlinear, not any of the stuff that everybody understands, but I mean, kind of the in the weeds stuff. What's the biggest thing from your perspective?
Well, if I'm going to keep it to color grading and the craft of what we're talking about, absolutely the biggest change is in display technology. For 30 years, I've had access to high quality displays that show me what an image actually looks like. Unfortunately, none of my audience has ever had access to those kinds of displays. And it's a big problem in what I do, which is, well, what happens when I walk out of the color grading suite? I literally have a $10,000 worth of gear whose only job is to calibrate my $10,000 screens, right? What happens when you walk out of that room and you're out in the wild? And the answer is, man, iPads are awesome. I mean, you look at the display technology on an iPhone or an iPad specifically, and you're getting 95% of what I've got in my grading suite to the point that I just got accepted onto a job. They've hired me, and I wrote into the contract that we're going to have 2 different devices for approval. One, you're going to approve the colors on my screen. You're also going to approve the colors on a modern iPad set at 50% brightness with night shift turned off in a dim room, right? Because if you follow those rules and you look at the file I've handed you and you watch it there and you have a note for me, I can look at my OLED and your note matches my screen.
Well, that reminds me, I mean, back in the day when we used to finish projects, the company I was working for, and a client would be all happy, and then they would go home and they would see their commercial or their TV show, a week later, and they'd call us up and say, what happened? It looked terrible last night. And, in most cases, in those days, it was, if you were lucky, it was, outputted to a digibeta that was then dubbed to something else and then put on somebody's hard drive at a station, or I mean, even when we got to HD, it was still compressed HD, and then who knows what different networks and different providers were doing, on their end. So yeah, I remember those concerns.
And if you're going to sell yourself as a colorist or sell your color correction or color grading skills to a client, you have to have a good answer to that question. You need to have an answer to, well, why does it look like crap when I watch it on I saw my spot at my parents' house and it looked terrible. Why? And you need to have that answer. You need to know what that answer is. And so this is why I'm really happy and very excited. To me, that's one of the biggest advances over the last 10 years is we're actually getting to the point where our clients in the wild can view the ones and zeros. Because, one of the things I teach in my trainings is ones and zeros have meaning. The bits and bytes on your hard drive, the color information on there is very specifically defined. One of the reasons why my calibrated displays are so expensive is because they can accurately show me the values on my hard drive. And that hasn't been true out in the wild. And right now, I think the iPad and the iPhone is probably the best device for that. But more and more, we're starting to see mostly kind of home theater, home enthusiast grade displays. You can get pretty close. And if you put a LUT box on the front of it and do proper calibration, you could dial in a $2,000 OLED to look like, my $15,000 OLED, right? That's possible. I wouldn't trust it as a finishing display, but certainly as a viewing display, it's fantastic. And so we're there. So that to me is one of the big, obviously the other big thing over the last 10 years is just the affordability of everything. But this is why I transitioned out of tape-based. Back when we went the transition from tape to digital, a lot of pros didn't make that transition very well. And they couldn't they couldn't understand nonlinear software. They eventually got out of the business, forced out of the business. But I saw very early on when I could get a DeckLink card into my Mac Pro back in 2000, and it could put out 10-bit SDI to go into a digibeta machine, that's when I knew the future was here. And that's when I understood that it was only a matter of time before a laptop could do everything we as video professionals need to do. Just an off-the-shelf, we don't have to go to these SGI solutions and all of these various big iron boxes. You'd be able to go out to the store, buy a laptop, ingest all your video, edit it, color correct it, spit it out without a problem. And that's largely true today until you start getting into larger frame sizes. And that's where things bottleneck today is on the frame sizes. So, and pushing that many pixels at once.
So what's the next decade bring? Does it solve that problem with the file sizes and pixels?
So eventually we're going to get to a point where you get to these diminishing returns in terms of file sizes. But yeah, so I think over the next 10 years, we will solve that, where your normal laptop will be able to handle 12-bit, 12K files without a problem. That'll happen. I think the most interesting thing coming up in the future is machine learning. And I think what we've seen in machine learning right now is it's barely even child's play. We're toying with it, at this point. We haven't even seen what's possible. I think the craft, especially of color grading, a lot of the mundane tasks will be computerized. And by mundane, I mean setting initial exposure, initial balance, maybe even shot matching. The human will be relegated mostly to making sure that the machine didn't go off base, right? Dialing it in a little bit. But then the job of the human will be the final step, which will be the storytelling step, which will be the emotional step, which will be, even some of this will be able to be driven by computer algorithms, machine learning algorithms, where, one of the things I teach is, we have to focus the eye, right? You figure the average shot length in a 1950s feature film was about 8 seconds a shot, right? You'd have these shots that would hold for 20, 30 seconds. Well, now in YouTube generation, the average shot length is about 2.5 seconds, right? And so there's a bigger need for someone at some point to be able to craft the image in such a way to let the audience know where exactly should they be looking at every second as the cuts happen, because the brain doesn't have enough time to really fully process it. So things like vignettes and, there are all sorts of techniques you can use to let the audience know where should I be looking at this very moment, that are subtle. You don't really see it, but you can tell it just by looking at the image. All of a sudden, boom, I need to look over there, right? So I think the role of the craftsman will be to focus on the emotional, the storytelling, and the look side of things. And the more mundane tasks of shot matching and black balancing and things like that will largely be able to be taken over by computers. And it's going to be a challenge for existing colorists. They're going to, how do you make this transition? Already a single job is, if it lasts 5 days, that's a long time. Now I've just lost 3 days worth of work, and it's relegated to a computer that can do it while I sleep. I wake up, and so now all of a sudden, now I've got to fill in 3 times as much work to get the same amount of money back, right? In order, as far as my career is concerned, and making money. So I think that's going to be the biggest challenge. It's interesting when people talk to me about the transition from editor to colorist. What's the biggest difference between being a full-time editor, full-time colorist? Well, as a full-time editor, you can have a job last 6 months. As a full-time colorist, I'm getting 5 or 6 billable days. And that's it, right? And a lot of jobs are much smaller. So my calendar suddenly feels like this big, enormous black hole that needs to be filled a lot. But back in my editor days, I could book out 2 weeks at a time without a problem. And so that's the biggest transition if you're in editing and thinking of becoming a full-time colorist. I think that's your biggest challenge that you're going to face, is filling your time in a way that, you can keep making your money. Good thing is you get higher rates, but still, the calendar is a challenge.
Yeah. So let's talk products. Do you have any specific recommendations or some of your favorites?
I got to tell you, I love DaVinci Resolve. I really do. They have spent a lot of time over the past 6 years creating their own, from scratch, brand new code, nonlinear editing system. And it is finally at the point today where I tell all the editors I work with, you need to be looking at DaVinci Resolve. You need to be thinking about migrating from whatever software you're using right now and working in DaVinci Resolve. Because it's fast, it's modern, it's responsive. It works on a wide variety of platforms. It's both Mac and PC based. And it kind of borrows a little bit from everyone, right? It takes some of the good ideas from Final Cut. It takes some of the good ideas from Premiere, takes some of the good ideas from Avid, I think. It's been a while since I worked on Avid, and I'm not sure how many ideas they've pulled from Avid, but I'm sure they have, right? To the point where when a Final Cut editor gets and starts working on DaVinci Resolve, they're like, oh, wow, they just ripped off Final Cut. And then a Premiere editor transitions onto DaVinci Resolve. They're like, oh, wow, they just ripped off Premiere, right? How can those two things both be simultaneously true? We know they're very different environments. It's because it borrows heavily from a lot of these existing ideas. And then it builds and creates its own ideas. And it also brings, in my mind, it's the only software that has fulfilled the promise of integrating editing with post audio, with visual effects, with color grading, right? Final Cut Studio tried to do this in the early 2000s, and it was a nightmare. And it was a nightmare because of translating the timeline information. I could take my edits and translate those into my color grading software, but speed ramps wouldn't work properly because the color grading software looks at speed ramps differently than the editing software does. That's all gone with DaVinci Resolve. What you have is a single timeline with a user interface that rewraps itself to match the environment of the skill set that's being utilized. So if you're an editor, the UI of DaVinci Resolve looks completely different. Utterly different than if you're in Fairlight doing an audio mix. That Fairlight user interface is completely custom to what a professional post-audio professional expects, right? You've got side chains, and you've got, effects that you can route in and out, even to external boxes, and you can drive the audio interface, like the physical hardware if you want to. But the key is the timeline itself. The shots, the metadata applied to those shots is precisely the same. It just switches the UI. This means you can hand off from creative to creative, from skill set to skill set, and not worry about mangling the timeline in the process. You don't have to reconform. And in fact, the job that I just told you about, where I had them sign off for approvals on the iPad as the real world reference display, they edited on DaVinci Resolve, my first actual job coming in, 90-minute feature that was edited in DaVinci Resolve. And the editor, he's like, I love it. It's fantastic. And I'm like, I love you, because all you got to do is hand me the project file, hand me the source media. I relink, and there's no more conforming to be done. And they will then walk away with my project files, which is another issue. It's like, as a colorist, now I'm giving them access to my project file. And what does that mean to me as a colorist? And I wrote in my contract, I said, look, if you make any changes, you have to add an additional credit by contract. You are agreeing to add additional color by. That's the only way I'll agree to do this job and hand you my project file. If anyone touches it, they get an additional credit as additional color. And then if they mess it up, it walked away from me, and they had the opportunity to change it. So that's probably the most interesting aspect of all this. But yeah, so DaVinci Resolve is my big thing, as some of my favorite software. And then, I've got hardware that I love to use as well. Stream decks, which are these programmable buttons with these lights that light up. And you can use this. It doesn't matter if you're a colorist, an audio person, an editor. You take all your keyboard shortcuts and you put them on a box, an external box, with custom images you can put on every button, and drop those on there. So all of a sudden now you can, with one button push, do these really complicated keyboard shortcuts, or things that are not keyboard shortcuttable that require XY positioning on the mouse. On the screen, you can actually program in the XY position to activate menu items that you frequently access. You can get this kind of automation going, and it really speeds up your workflow. So, as a colorist, my big thing is to get my hands off the mouse and onto my control surface. And for me, the button boxes, the Stream Decks especially, are a big part of that, where you take an affordable control surface and you match it, and you basically build it out using additional control surfaces that are programmable.
So, Patrick, we've talked a lot about the things you're involved with. So I don't want to screw up any of the various ways that people can follow you or engage with you. So tell us what websites or social media pages people need to know.
So I don't do a lot of social media for reasons I define. I'm a little bit of an extroverted introvert. And I find social media really wears me down. I don't play well with social media. Probably the best place is Mixing Light. So if you go to mixinglight.com, you go to the Contact Us page, and you just fill it out and say, hey, Patrick. And, I do all the customer support, most of the customer support for Mixing Light. So all that stuff comes to me. And if you want to talk to me directly, that's a great place. The other place is Tao of Color, TAO of color.com. That's my newsletter that goes out every week. If you're interested in the craft of color grading and keeping up with it, sign up there. But there's also there's a Contact Us page there as well. You can fill that out, and that'll send to me. At some point, there will be a website at patrickinhofer.com. It's probably dead right now. Maybe by the time this podcast is released, it'll be active. So you can always try punching that in and seeing if that works. And then that'll have my demo reel up there, and contact information and things like that.
So Patrick, by trade, I'm actually a post-production person. So this has been a lot of fun for me to kind of relive some of my old post days. So I really appreciate you taking the time and offering the insight. And we really appreciate you being on the Film Florida podcast.
Well, John, I really appreciate you inviting me onto the Film Florida podcast, and really the work you do as well. I mean, having come from New York, being, one of the big two bicoastal cities where a lot of, the so-called A work gets done, and then coming down to Florida, I really appreciate that there's an organization out there that tries to unify and unite a lot of the talent, there is some amazing talent down here in Florida. I've been amazed at the level of quality of work as well as the quality of craftsperson down here. And I love being part of the Florida film community. It's something I really enjoy, and I enjoy it even more than when I was in New York. I mean, New York is such a rat race, and you never feel like you're at the top of the heap. And when you get outside of New York, it's like, it doesn't matter if you're at the top of the heap or not. It's like you're doing what you're doing because you love it, and not because there's so much work out there that it just falls out of the sky for you. And so I really appreciate how you help bring and keep a community together. As someone who's built communities myself online, I know how hard that is. And I thank you for the work you do as well.
Well, Patrick, I appreciate that. That was very kind.
You bet. Have yourself a great day.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Film Florida podcast. For more information about Film Florida, go to filmflorida.org or visit our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Check out the Film Florida merchandise at teespring.com/stores/Film Florida, and please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast.